Hello, everyone. My name is Pernille Ironside, and I'm absolutely delighted and honored to be able to have this conversation with you today on SDG 16, which is relating to peace, justice, and strong institutions. I practically grew up on the campus of U of A, with both my parents having been professors and ultimately chairs of their respective faculties, and completing my first degree in commerce at the U of A before I went on elsewhere to further degrees in law. So being able to connect with you, faculty and members of the U of A community, and beyond is really a privilege and something that I'm so proud that the U of A is shining a spotlight on the SDGs. Just a very little bit about me. I work for UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, and my passion for social justice and having become a lawyer specialized in international human rights and humanitarian law has taken me around the world. And I've been working in multiple contexts over these years, most recently in Nigeria, but across Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. And so what I'd like to draw on from that experience, and I'm now speaking to you from New York, where in 2020, just before the pandemic, I took up a new position at UNICEF headquarters as Deputy Director of our Division on Data Analytics and Planning and Monitoring. But for the majority of my career, I've served in roles that focus on child protection from violence, exploitation, abuse, particularly in conflict zones, but also in other forms of emergencies and natural disasters or complex environments. So I speak with you today about SDG 16 from that vantage point, and I will take the lens of child rights, since that's what has been my focus over my career, and I hope that you will also enjoy seeing and learning about SDG 16 from that important perspective. So with that, what I propose to do is give a brief overview of what is encompassed in SDG 16, and then deep dive into a couple of components, particularly those related to violence, exploitation, and abuse of children, and circle back to and conclude with what it means to have a just, peaceful, and inclusive society, which ultimately is at the heart of SDG 16. I'm going to situate my remarks also in terms of the pandemic, which is and the impact that is having on SDG 16 and its potential realization. It's affecting all of us, and it is, I believe, highly relevant to kind of include that perspective. I hope that's of interest to you all as well, and I hope that you and your families have been keeping safe throughout this pandemic as best as possible and adjusting to all that has entailed. So let's begin. And there's no PowerPoint, so it's really a conversation with me, and I wish I could be there in person with you, but such are the circumstances at this time. What at the outset, just to kind of lay the context, SDG 16 really is about peace, stability, human rights, and effective governance based on the rule of law, which are central to the realization of child rights and really a prerequisite for sustainable development. And here we are in 2021 with with just 10 years left until 2030 when the SDGs are meant to be fulfilled. So this is the decade of action, and we're at the beginning of it. And boy, there's a lot of action that still needs to take place. You'll see shortly that even prior to the COVID pandemic, the world was really collectively off track with the SDGs, and including SDG 16. And that has only been exacerbated as a result of the pandemic and the implications that it's had for everybody, but also in particular for children. So SDG 16 includes several explicit targets for children. For example, there's 16.2 on violence against children. There's 16.9 on legal identity for all, which includes birth registration for children, as well as many others where child rights are more implicit, such as 16.3 on the rule of law and equal access to justice, 16.6 on strong institutions, and 16.7 on inclusive societies. So I'd like to focus first on 16.2 and related to ending abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence and torture of children, which is really of critical importance to both achieving the SDGs, but also to UNICEF's mandate. And I've really seen in person firsthand in the context where I've worked how vital this is. And as governments are reporting SDG progress and their plans, including on this dimension of 16.2, there's really an opportunity to strengthen the connections between the global, how that's reported globally, and the national implementation with a view to really impacting the lives of individual children and families. So, sadly, there are millions of children who experience emotional, physical, and sexual violence in their homes, in their communities, in their schools and workplaces, detention centers and institutions, as well as online. And close to 300 million, or 3 in 4 children between the ages of 2 and 4 experience violent discipline by their caregivers regularly. Just absorb that. 3 in 4 children between the ages of 2 and 4. Worldwide, around 15 million adolescent girls aged 15 to 19 have experienced forced sex in their lifetime, and every 7 minutes, somewhere in the world, an adolescent is killed by an act of violence. Around half of the students aged 13 to 15 worldwide, which amounts to about 150 million children, report having experienced peer-to-peer violence in and around school. So the ambition of the SDG target in 16.2 is to end violence against children. And this could not be more relevant and important today. In fact, the onset and the ongoing kind of crisis of COVID-19 has only exacerbated what children are, the risks that they're experiencing from violence, and especially kids who are already the most vulnerable. The pandemic has caused unprecedented disruption to education, with a peak of more than 1.5 billion children in 190 countries out of school. It's also meant that 1.8 billion children who live in about 104 countries where violence prevention and response services have been disrupted due to the pandemic and the related containment measures. So around 2/3 of countries with disruptions have reported at least one type of service that has been severely affected. And countries with weaker child protection systems are clearly most affected by these disruptions. And in situations of infectious disease outbreaks, as we are experiencing, it's children who are particularly vulnerable, as they can disrupt these outbreaks. They disrupt the environments in which children grow and develop, but the measures used to prevent and control the spread of infectious diseases can also expose children to heightened protection risks. Previous pandemics and epidemics, for example, have all generated insights into the negative protection impacts of health crises. And while outcomes are typically multi-layered, the child protection risks during COVID have entailed increased psychosocial distress, self-harm, emotional and physical abuse, including witnessing of domestic violence, neglect with basic needs being unmet, online harassment, bullying, and violence. And violence for those also living on the streets or who are separated and unaccompanied from their caregivers, including in institutions and refugee and migrant camps. So the mitigation measures that can be put in place, or ought to be put in place and taken by governments to ensure the delivery of essential prevention and response services during the pandemic, and of course, prior to the pandemic as well, are even more vital now. And this is where there are a lot of compromises being made that are negatively impacting children. And a couple of measures, good measures that governments are taking or ought to take that help mitigate this impact during the pandemic could be described as, for example, prioritizing the maintaining or adapting of critical prevention and response services to protect children from violence as part of their public health response, with consideration to those children who are most vulnerable. And this could entail, for example, designating social service workforce as essential and assuring their safety and protection, ensuring that child protection, health, and justice service continue through adopting kind of adaptations to their programs, strengthening child helplines, and ensuring there's adequate responsiveness and making positive parenting resources available, increasing online protection for children. That could entail working with families and educators as well as technology companies, and maintaining children's access to teachers and to other school-based counseling services during the lockdown, and ensuring that there's child-friendly procedures in place to identify, respond to, and refer incidents of violence as schools reopen. And of course, there's the bigger investment as well in terms of social protection to enable livelihoods to counteract the shocks, financial and emotional, in terms of job loss and the ensuing kind of disruption and hardship that is causing families and ultimately children who often bear the brunt. That's on 16.2, and I'd now like to pivot quickly to just speak give some top line on, what does it mean to have peaceful, just, and inclusive societies? So peaceful, just societies, here it's really looking at the heart of of places where high levels of violence, conflict, insecurity, crime, and exploitation, which are being accentuated by COVID-19, are having a profound impact on the sustainable development of the society, and where millions of children are exposed to, violence and distress and abuse. I alluded to, but at the beginning, but there are 31 million children who have been uprooted from their homes, including over 17 million who are internally displaced, and just over 12 million refugees and 1 million asylum seekers. Now, the strengthening of the child protection systems and social services workforce across all these sectors, whether it's social welfare, justice, health, education, security, also has a positive impact in these more extenuating circumstances of where children are displaced, uprooted, or in even different countries. A just society here, what SDG 16 is aiming for is on strengthening the rule of law and promoting human rights as a key towards establishing peaceful and inclusive societies. And so while the rights to access to justice applies equally to adults and to children, it's often overlooked in relation to children who are in contact with the law, whether as alleged offenders, as victims, or as witnesses. And so for children to really exercise their rights in a meaningful way, it's important that they have access to effective representation, and remedies must be available in order for them to enforce their rights and seek reparation. And clearly, again, during the pandemic and beyond, the human rights of every child who is deprived of their liberty must be fully respected, protected, and fulfilled. And really, a precursor to any child or any person being able to claim their rights is having their very existence recognized by the state. And to be recognized as a person before the law through a legal identity is, that's why a birth certificate as proof of legal identity is really critical to ensuring that children can enjoy those rights right from birth. And there are so many children, millions, who still do not have this very basic right to a legal identity because their births are not registered, and as a fundamental precursor to all the rights, realization of all of their the rights to which they are entitled. And kind of finally, in terms of inclusive societies, here it's about engaging people as equal participants in decision-making, policy-making, and law-making processes, and ensuring that adults and children have the rights to express their views freely in all matters affecting them. This requires that those views be heard and that they be given due weight in terms of in accordance with their age and maturity, and that this, if participation, that it's appreciated and recognized that it can really enrich decision-making processes. So children should not be excluded from processes and decisions that affect them, and society more broadly, based on just because they happen to be children, or they, because of their gender, or they may have a disability or other type of status that may affect or may lead them to otherwise be excluded. So promoting this kind of meaningful participation in an inclusive society is really also at the heart of SDG 16. So that, in a nutshell, is an overview of SDG 16 on peace, justice, and institutions from a kind of a child rights lens. I hope you found it interesting, particularly in its contextualization also now during this pandemic that is affecting each and every one of us. As I said at the outset, this SDG and others are not on track to being realized by 2030, their target date. And this has only been exacerbated as a result of the pandemic and the global recession that's, with all of its knock-on effects. So the redoubling of efforts this year and for the years leading up to 2030 is certainly a priority for us here at UNICEF. And we also advocate that for all of the governments and the individual people who can, working together, all make a difference and make the world a better, safer place and more just and inclusive for everyone, and particularly for children. Please be well, and thank you for the opportunity to engage with you on this.